Hey, welcome, church family, to the second Theology Thursday, this time with visuals. Hopefully, if everything goes well, you'll be seeing right here exactly what I'm seeing right here. Like I said, this is our second one of these. If you watched the first one, you know that our goal here is to keep us all feeling connected, even while we're all in our own homes, sheltering in place. And specifically on Thursday nights, the goal is for us to engage our minds and our hearts in theological study. And hopefully that'll not just help us to feel productive, but will actually increase our love for God and our knowledge of God. And so tonight we're going to be looking at the Incarnation. And ultimately what that is the question of who and what is Jesus. And the answer to that is not just technical stuff that will help us know more facts about God, but ultimately, I believe, a proper understanding of the Incarnation is something that is deeply comforting and beautiful and helpful, especially in a situation like the one we're in right now. The Incarnation is also, of course, incredibly deep water. We could spend a whole lot longer than half an hour talking about it, but we are going to do our best to keep it accessible, straightforward, and something that'll really be helpful for absolutely anybody, regardless of how much prior knowledge you have. Now, anytime you talk about Jesus or the Incarnation to someone who is not a Christian, you're likely to get some version of, well, Jesus was a good teacher. People usually have really positive stuff to say about Jesus. He was somebody who taught peace, or he was somebody who kind of challenged the existing authority structures of his time. Some people from other religions will even say he was a prophet, he was enlightened, he had the special connection with God. But the caveat, whether spoken or unspoken, is always, yeah, great guy, but not God. He can be a good teacher, he can even be a prophet of God, but he was not God. But the contention that Christians have held from the very beginning is that Jesus was not just a great teacher, but was in fact God in the flesh. That's what incarnation means. And so we can look to verses like John 1:1, the famous opening verse of John's gospel that describes this very clearly. John says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Maybe the most beautiful sentence ever written. And John goes on in verse 17 to say that this word, logos in Greek, is Jesus. And so he opens his entire gospel by saying, that word, that Jesus, is God and was with God from the very beginning. He's eternal, with God, he is God. We could show a lot of other verses that kind of explain and defend that Jesus was God, but that's for a different episode. For tonight, we'll just start here and understand that Christians have, from the very beginning, not just revered Jesus as a prophet, but worshiped him as God himself. But there's an equally important claim that Christians have made from the beginning that a lot of us tend to lose touch with and have a harder time connecting to. And John articulates that 13 verses after this one. He says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." So Jesus was with God and was God. He is eternal, he is God, and yet that God took on flesh, became flesh, incarnated, and dwelt among us. Many of you have probably heard that word dwelt means to set up a tent. It means to tabernacle. In the Old Testament, the Israelites carried with them all of the things to set up a tent everywhere they stayed, and in that tent the presence of God dwelled in a special, immediate way. Here John says that's what the body of Jesus was. In other words, John 1:1 says Jesus is God, and John 1:14 says Jesus was and is human. And that's been the testimony of the faithful church from the very beginning. We have always affirmed the humanity of Jesus. And it's really not hard to see why. If you just read Scripture straightforwardly, you'll see Jesus is portrayed as human. He was born like every other human being. We know that from the Christmas accounts that are in 3 out of 4 Gospels. He grew inside the body of his mother. He was born as a vulnerable, tiny baby, grew into a boy, and then grew into a man. And as a man, he experienced all of the necessary limitations and weaknesses that are common to all of us. So Luke tells us that he grew. He grew not just physically, but it says he grew in wisdom and stature. So he learned things and grew. He was tempted. 3 out of 4 Gospels talk about that as well. He got hungry. That's just one example, but you can see that in plenty of places. He got tired, he got thirsty, he slept, and then there are even deeper and more complex ways in which he was clearly human. Mark 13 tells us that there were things that he didn't know while he was on earth in his body, so that Jesus, as a human being, doesn't know the time of the second coming. He gets asked and he says, the Father knows that, the Son doesn't. Now, of course, there's plenty of debate and questions about kind of what are the boundaries of what he did and didn't know during his earthly time, but clearly there's at least one thing he did not know. He learned, we talked about how he learned wisdom and he grew in stature in Luke, but the author of Hebrews actually says that Jesus learned obedience by suffering. And that suffering is one of the most human things we see about him. At the end of his life, all of the Gospels talk about him being beaten, tortured, and dying on a cross, executed. And that death is maybe the most human and significant thing about it. And so all of these things and many more bear witness to the fact that Jesus truly experienced life as a human being here on earth. John Piper likes to say that if he were born here and now, he'd have a social security number. He was really, truly human. And depending on the tradition you were raised in and how long you've been a Christian, thinking of the humanness, the kind of finiteness and limitations of Jesus as a human being can cause a serious feeling of discomfort. We're just not used to thinking of him that way. Most of us are more used to thinking of Jesus like this kind of hyper-spiritual, floaty, like inhuman automaton that's just, a body machine being driven around by God and not really human. But it's absolutely essential that as Christians, we do think of him as truly being human. Again, John, this time in one of his letters, says, "By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, and every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God." John's describing the litmus test of testing spirits, and he says the key is, did Jesus come in the flesh? And those who do not confess that Jesus came as a human, are false. And so what that means is that it's essential that we understand and connect to this idea of the humanness of Jesus, to get the incarnation deep into our mind and soul so that we can understand Jesus correctly. So Christians have held for thousands of years that Jesus was fully God and fully man, the two natures, the human nature and the divine nature, united in one person. And the question that causes us to take that kind of headfirst dive into the deep end of the pool theologically is, how does that work? Now, there's a fancy theological term that gets used that's actually really helpful. It's the hypostatic union. Simply put, hypostasis or hypostasis, I'll probably use them interchangeably, one's the Greek way of saying it, is the substance or the subsistence of something. It is the concrete reality that underlies something. So it means actual existence rather than just an abstract idea. It's that which lies underneath the idea of something, what something truly is, the substance of a thing. This is a term that was around in Greek philosophy even before the time of the New Testament, but the New Testament authors use it too. There's 5 times in the New Testament that this word gets used, and most of the time it talks about the kind of assurance or confidence that we can have in something. So it's about the kind of underlying concrete reality on which we place the things that we believe. Most famously, Hebrews 11 says that faith is the hypostasis, the assurance of things that we hope for. We can actually jump over here to Logos, the Bible software that I use, to take a look at that. That's Hebrews 11. The author says, faith, pistis, is the hypostasis of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And this already is a beautiful teaching of the Bible in and of itself. It says that faith is not just a fluffy, blind trust in something that may or may not be true, but faith is something that is a confident trust that rests upon a concrete truth. There is a reality, a substance to the thing that we hope for. Our hope rests upon concrete reality. And this is where it gets really Christological, because that same author starts off the book by using that word to describe Jesus in relation to God. It says well, let's look at that over here too. There's a lot of cool things in this verse. The author says that Jesus is the radiance of the glory of God. It's beautiful because that word radiance can also mean dawn or daybreak. He's the dawning of the glory of God, and the exact character, imprint, from the Greek word kerygma, it means stamp or mark, perfect representation. The exact imprint of his hypostasis, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. He is that which perfectly represents, like a seal or a stamp, the underlying reality, the substance of the true God, the true nature of God, perfectly represented by Jesus. And so that's the claim that hypostatic union is making, that in Jesus you have somebody who is fully human and fully man, but in one subsistence, one hypostasis, one person, without confusion. Now, where the kind of controversy and difficulty comes in is trying to describe how that works. So you might start to intuitively just ask, okay, so like, are they equal, the two natures, or like does one take over the other? Is one in charge of the other? Does the human nature get replaced by the divine nature? How do they kind of interact? And the good news is that this is territory that Christians have done really good work on since the very beginning of the church. And we can trace the development of good Christology, good theology of the Incarnation, by tracing all of the false teachings that have popped up throughout church history and how they've been dealt with. Because there have been a huge number of Christological heresies. It's probably the number one area where you see false teachings pop into the church over and over and over and get combated by the biblically faithful Christians who are trying to maintain orthodoxy. Now, heresy is a word I just used. It's a scary sounding word. At the simplest level, it means a teaching that does not accurately represent Christianity, deemed by the rest of the church to say, hey, this no longer is Christian. You're coloring so far outside of the lines of what the Bible teaches that thanks but no thanks, that's no longer Christian. And there have been tons of these about Jesus over the last 2,000 years. And it's important for us to know them, not just so that we can understand kind of the territory of healthy Christology, but also because these heresies never really go away. For the last 2,000 years, most of them have continued to pop up every few years or so, just with, a new set of clothes on, but it's the same old teachings. So we'll just take a really basic look at a few of the big ones from history. And that'll help us understand kind of the territory marked out by faithful Christians in which we can explore who Jesus is. So Docetism taught, this is one of the earliest heresies that you actually see John almost certainly addressing in his writings. Docetism taught that Jesus was truly God, but he was not actually human. He only appeared to be human. It was an illusion shown to humanity, but he wasn't actually a human being. And this one is incredibly important because, sort of like I said earlier, otherwise faithful Christians, if we don't understand and emphasize the humanness of Jesus, we can accidentally drift into a sort of soft Docetism without even knowing it, where we start to forget that Jesus was a human and picture him as, this kind of floaty cloud Jesus that's not really human. The opposite mistake that came shortly after was called Ebionism, and that was the idea that Jesus was truly human, but he was not God at all. And this remains a popular belief to this day, that Jesus was an incredible, great man who attained special status with God and a special connection with God, but he was not actually God in his very nature. Nestorianism was a hugely popular and dangerous heresy that got a bunch of popularity in the early church, but was eventually considered to be a heresy from a lot of faithful struggle of good Christians. But the basic idea that Nestorius taught is that the two natures, fully God and fully human, were not really united in Jesus, but they remained distinct and separate. So Jesus basically functionally becomes two people in this view. Jesus is God, Jesus is God and he's human, but there's not really a true union between those two natures. Arianism was another heresy that was incredibly popular in the early church, and this taught that Jesus was not truly God in the sense of what we mean by God. Arianism taught that the one true God created the second person of the Trinity, Jesus, the Logos, whatever you want to call it, That was the first and greatest creation of God, but he wasn't co-eternal, not of the same substance as God, and so not truly God, just a great created, exalted being, which messes with both the deity and humanity of Jesus. And finally, there was Apollinarianism, or Apollinarism. And Apollinarianism taught something kind of unique and kind of different than the other ones, but one that was also eventually ruled as a heresy for a variety of reasons. And this was the belief that Jesus was not fully, truly human, because the human man Jesus had his consciousness or his will taken over by the Logos in the Incarnation. So what happens is you have Jesus, the body, which is a human body, but instead of having a regular human mind, human consciousness, the Christ, or the Logos, takes that part of him over and almost does, drive him like an automaton. That, the driver's seat of Jesus is taken over by the Christ. So there's the God element and the human element, but they're not truly united together. Now, that's an oversimplification of all of them, and we could go into way more detail, but you can probably start to see what they all have in common already, right? Christians hold that Jesus is fully God and fully man, two natures united without confusion in one person, one substance, one hypostasis. And all of those heresies and many others are just belief systems that start to tweak a little bit with one or the other of those ideas. It's either the nature of God, the nature of human, or that kind of perfect unity between them. And man, it can just feel, and some of you are probably feeling this way right now, like, okay, this is just such like nitty gritty theological hair splitting. Like, why does this kind of thing really matter? But the truth is, these differences in beliefs about Jesus have a massive impact on other theological things that Christians believe. And if you push that first domino of the nature of Jesus and the hypostatic union, other stuff down the line gets absolutely demolished. So take just a couple examples. Think about Docetism. Docetism, again, is the belief that the man Jesus was an illusion. That he's not really a human being. It's just God appearing as a human to other humans. Can a God that only appears to be human really die in your place? Can he die for humanity? I mean, in Docetism, what actually dies on the cross? An illusion of humanity. There's no real sacrifice there. There's no real substitute there. And then further, what is then resurrected 3 days later? If that's not the first resurrection of a human being into a new creation body, then what does it tell us as humans when we look at that? Is that something that we can actually hope for, place our trust in, look forward to? Or is it just kind of like a puppet show where we're being shown something that looks really great but isn't actually us? All of these things and many, many other things start to fall apart. Similarly, the Jesus of Apollinaris could not experience temptation. That was something that Apollinaris actually taught explicitly, that because the conscious will of the human was replaced by the Logos, that God that kind of drove, the body of Jesus around could not really be tempted in any way, could not really experience pain, could not really experience any sort of struggle or danger. And so it's a God who you and I cannot possibly in any way relate to. A God who can't really represent us. And so what happens is the more you kind of go down the rabbit trail of tracing how these ideas affect other theological categories in Christianity, it's like pulling out a foundation stone where eventually the rest of the building will absolutely crumble. If you mess with your conception of Jesus even a tiny bit, it's like setting a railroad track just, tiny, tiny bit off. You couldn't even tell the difference. But 100 miles down the line, 1,000 miles down the line, you're not even in the same state that you're aiming for. And so it's crucial for Christians to maintain this belief that Christians have held from the beginning, that Jesus is both fully God and fully man, those two natures united perfectly in one person without confusion. And again, this is why the church has guarded this belief from the beginning and continues to. This is a big part of what we continue to do, because honestly, like I said before, these heresies never really go away. They go dormant for a while, they come back with a new paint job, and they go on, talk shows and speaking tours and the New York Times bestseller list. And so we have to have a clear idea of this stuff and evaluate things critically. But here's the thing. Our belief about Jesus being fully God and fully human is also incredible, beautiful, good news. Because a Jesus who is fully God and fully human impacts our life in a completely different way than any of those other conceptions of Jesus possibly could. And I think, like I said at the start of this thing, that understanding this is maybe the most comforting thing you could think about during this time of isolation that you're in. Let's look at just a couple of the beautiful implications of the hypostatic union. The first is that Jesus can be our perfect representative. Unlike Adam, who's the first representative of humanity, who failed, like every other human fails to represent humanity well, Jesus represents us faithfully. He's tempted like Adam, but he doesn't sin. When he is offered whatever he wants, he says, "Not my will, but the will of God be done." And then he perseveres even through horrific suffering on our behalf. And that makes him uniquely qualified to represent humanity as humanity. He's also, similarly, the perfect mediator between humanity and God. And this is a beautiful concept that we don't think about often enough. In the book of Job, which is an ancient Hebrew book, hundreds if not thousands of years before Jesus was born, it's written. And Job is a character who experiences horrific suffering, and he has no idea why, and he sees the suffering as injustice. And a huge part of the book is him poetically addressing God and saying, "God, tell me, why am I suffering this way? Why can't I argue directly to you?" And let's jump to that, because it's one of my favorite verses in the entire Old Testament. It's in Job 9. Oh, not John 9. Job 9:32. He's talking about how he wants to bring his case before God, but he says he can't, and here's why. He says, "Because he's not a man as I am, that I might answer him, that we should come to trial together. There is no arbiter between us who might lay his hand on us both." And so Job recognizes the need, even years and years before Jesus is born, the need for someone who could put a hand on humanity and a hand on God. What could possibly do that? Who could possibly do that? Later, Paul would say, that's exactly what Jesus is. 1 Timothy 2:5, he says, "For there is one God, and there is one mediator between God and men, the man, Christ Jesus," Messiah Jesus. So Paul says that arbiter that Job wanted, that humanity has always needed, someone who can put a hand on humanity and a hand on God, that's Jesus. And why can he do that? Why is he uniquely qualified to be our mediator? Because he is God and man, fully and perfectly united in one person without confusion. He's also able to be our perfect substitute. And we'll get probably on a future episode deeper into the idea of atonement, but at the simplest level, the Bible is clear that God makes atonement for sin by condemning sin in the flesh, not in a fake puppet of humanity, but in a human being. The man, Jesus, was tortured and died in our place, on our behalf. And the only way he can do that is if he is a human like us. Humanity's substitute had to be truly human. He also, and this is one of my favorite ideas, is he fulfills God's purpose for humanity. From the very beginning of Scripture, God planned to rule over creation through human representatives. And so Adam and every subsequent human failed in that task. They failed to represent God to creation and to co-rule creation with him. But then Jesus comes as the fulfillment of humanity's purpose, to obey God perfectly, to rule with God on the earth. And he gives us, therefore, an example to look to of what humanity perfectly united with God would look like. And again, every single one of those heresies we looked at wreaks havoc on that idea. And finally, and probably most significantly for the situation we're in now, he is sympathetic. He can relate to us. He can identify with us because he's a human and has lived as a human. The author of Hebrews says this beautifully. In Hebrews 4, he says, "We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. I mean, how beautiful is that? We don't have a faraway God or high priest who can't understand what our experience is like. Because Jesus has been truly human, he knows exactly what we're experiencing. He can sympathize with our weaknesses, our temptations, and yet has demonstrated how to pass through those in a perfectly obedient way. So, in the middle of this pandemic, while you're isolated, many of you, I know because you're telling me, many of you are feeling lonely. You're feeling isolated. I know many of you live by yourself, and so sheltering in place means a lot of loneliness. Many of you are feeling scared. You're feeling fear of the future, and understandably so for many of you. Whether it's about the sickness itself or about the future of your job or life events that you might miss out on. There's a lot to be worried about and anxious about in the future. And another thing that, honestly, we're not talking about as much, but it's incredibly important, is unique temptations in a situation like this. There are many of you who I guarantee are experiencing either brand new temptations or old temptations that are kind of rearing their head again while you're in this time of isolation, loneliness, boredom, too much time on your hands. And so there are temptations that just naturally increase in times like that. To all of that, the incarnation means that God says, I know. And he doesn't just know in an abstract way, like because he's omniscient, he knows everything. No, he knows experientially. He has felt what you're feeling. He has felt loneliness. He has felt worry. He has felt every human experience, but he has felt it perfectly in alignment with God, the way humans should feel them. So when Christians say, God is with you, it's not an empty platitude. It's not just like a trite little saying that kind of gets you out of having to say something really, comforting or helpful. No, it's a truth that is precious and central to what we believe, that God is with you. We believe in a God who doesn't stay far up in the clouds, far removed from you, but a God who comes to you, a God who came to us 2,000 years ago and comes to us today. And that is so much greater of a comfort than just the knowledge that there is some God who I believe exists, but I don't really know where he is. No, we serve a God who has been here, who has experienced this, who has felt what you're feeling. And so when you come to him and you pray to him, pray to the near God. Pray to the God who has experienced life here on earth. Draw comfort from knowing that your experiences aren't foreign to him. He has been there. He's felt what you're feeling. David Platt, who's an author and pastor who I love, he talked about how the world likes to think of all of the religions of the world as different paths up the same mountain. And he says the thing with Christianity is we're not a path up a mountain. We're a story about the God who comes down from the mountain to us, to the slums, the foothills of the mountain, to be with us. He knows we'd never come up that mountain, even if there was a path. And so he comes to us. And so I want to encourage you, draw comfort from that during this time. When you're feeling lonely, isolated, tempted, afraid, remember that you serve a God who knows what you're feeling, and bring your feelings to him. And also draw inspiration from this. What would it mean in a time like this that is so unique and weird and unprecedented in so many ways? What would it mean for us to imitate the Incarnation? If we were trying to imitate the God who crosses these incredible boundaries to be with those who are desperate and in need and unlovable, what would it mean to imitate that God in the situation we're in? How would we use our digital platforms differently? How would we use whatever influence we have on social media? How would we use our phones? How would we live our lives if we were seeking to imitate the incarnate God? I'm just starting to explore these ideas myself, and so I encourage you to spend some time thinking that, and maybe let us know in the comments on Facebook or on YouTube what you think are ways that we can imitate an incarnating God in the middle of this crisis.